going to add to this very interesting debate this morning by talking about something quite specific, which is Bicester Ecotown, where we've been involved developing the northwest of the site. So in terms of embedding quality and sustainability in design, it's really obviously part of the discussion that we've been having is about how is government assisting the transition into more sustainable low energy approaches to living, and frankly in the last 5 years it hasn't been particularly. Ecotowns were born as an idea in the last Labour government, and they have slowly been dwindling during the process. The initial vision for them was perhaps needed some reconsidering, and a fair amount of that went on prior to 2010, and in 2010 the funding for them was cut by about 50% and has been cut further. As I say, some of the criticism is correct. The idea of new towns suddenly being plonked here, there, everywhere could just increase the level of infrastructure required, car journeys made, etc. So we started this one about 3 years ago, with all of that knowledge, which was very helpful, because it's always interesting to jump into an involved conversation rather than right at the beginning when some of these factors are slightly cruder and one is knocked around by the politics of it a bit more than one is later on in the process. So we've been developing this with P3 Eco, also working with Alan Baxter, Farah Huxley Landscape, and Turley in planning. And the environmental ambitions for the Bicester Ecotown Northwest, we see as promising to make an outstanding model for the development of new settlements. The proposals for the master plan, part of the initial master plan was produced by Farrell, and then that's where we picked up and developed it from there. Do seek to bring about a distinctive and path-breaking development that hopefully will entice people to make their lives and bring up their families here and attract visitors to come and see a realised vision of a sustainable and smart future. In a way, that was the brief, our own brief for ourselves. Say, in the same way, and Bill's here, in the same way that Bedshead has been an urban inspiration for so many as an exemplar, we would hope that this contribution is the suburban to rural exemplar. Obviously a lot depends on the next stages and how much the developer and their investors commit to that vision. But we hope that we've enshrined at planning, and planning has now gone in for this scheme. We submitted it 6 months ago or so and are waiting for quite a long process to conclude, that we will see an exemplar built here which will be valuable in the conversation. So the master plan faithfully follows the requirements of this document, which is the Ecotown Supplement to Planning Policy Statement 1. And it sets out a framework to guide key determinants, which include land use, green infrastructure, density, employment, movement and governance, together with ambitious targets for environmental, social and economic sustainability. Policies and targets are obviously critical, but ultimately it's the quality of life of the ecotown that will really define whether it's a success or not, and that it will attract people to come and live here. So this is where we are. This is Bicester. So for those of you not familiar with that, that's just north of Oxford, and there's the actual site for the whole ecotown development, and that's the area that we're developing. and that sits within this area. This area here, which is part of the master plan from Farrell. Just to give you an idea of size, that's Hyde Park there. So we're talking 400 hectares for Northwest Bicester, and Hyde Park being 283. And then within there, the key characteristics that we picked up on from the Farrell master plan were really these various. You probably can't read the text on the left, but the numbers here, hopefully you can see, and that's a mixture of, one is the creation of a new boulevard to connect the east of the site, and positioning various schools and other local shops, other community facilities. They're the blue and pink blobs there. And number two then is a new pedestrian and cycle links connecting to wider Bicester. 3 is the large green space to the north of the site for playing fields, for not within the school, but for recreation by the whole area of the ecotown. Road connections of 4, and 6 is 6 isn't on that. Okay, don't worry. But the idea of then to pick up on those, but how we picked up on it, we went back and just thought, wait a minute, what are we actually trying to achieve here? What would be seen as a healthy way to consider inhabiting, living, picking up on some of the speakers from this morning, from Joe's overview about health and well-being, really looking at the activities that would take place within the ecotown and what might occur outside, and how would one, there's no point in pretending that everybody would just live there and not travel, but actually how does one create a center of gravity there that makes people want to be there. They don't sense that life is elsewhere, but obviously for certain things, foreign holidays, etc., it is elsewhere, and there's got to be good connections for that. But conceptually, to understand it, where play, learn and grow are really key to happen within the ecotown, work as well, but then it may be work is also in Bicester itself or beyond Bicester, and those connections need to be considered. So the kind of conceptual framework for us was really very much that everything in green there is what happens within the ecotown, but then that connection to the rest of the world is facilitated, and is facilitated in as low carbon a way as possible. In terms of infrastructure within the site, we were working with Metropolitan on that, looking at low energy and appropriate utility infrastructure. So spatially, that concept really of how to live in this area and how to value the natural capital of this site, and to work within the planning guidance for ecotowns, really led us to look very closely at the green infrastructure, and to really subvert that diagram at the top there, which is always driven by highways, car, facilitating arriving and leaving one's own house, which often we know in a way creates a series of unfortunate boundaries, to use Richard Sennett's terms, where one is actually cut off from one another and from green space, etc. Instead, we work very much with the green space as the key routes for movement through the ecotown, and that any roads were all very much secondary, so that one's perception is always of the green. 40% of the ecotown had to be open space. We took that much further and looked at densities, but also the perception of that. So it's not just in the exact area, it's also in what's your physical perception of green space of you yourself, where you live, how you relate to it. And I think that the experiential is absolutely critical and is often forgotten by those that are planning things out from a statistical basis. So really looking at all the various opportunities that were on offer and how to best use that infrastructure. There's something like within our site 4 kilometres of hedgerow, and the hedgerow then became a key starting point to looking at the site. But before we did that, we really studied the surrounding villages and the character of those, learning from good and bad, as I mentioned, cars, etc., but also how some of the boundaries between houses, etc., work, an edge of town, edge of village, the centre, and then studied a whole range of new towns and how effectively they've or not managed to create new neighbourhoods within towns. There's quite a lot to talk about, so I'm kind of paraphrasing some of these, but happy to talk about it in more detail later. So some which are creating mats of housing, others were more successfully integrating green into the housing mat. But we then really sort of thought, okay, let's look specifically now at this piece of land and let's actually understand it systemically. Take a look at it all from the different systems there. So starting with the contours of the site, and then the hedgerows being absolutely critical for the biodiversity of the area, to preserve them, but where we are just starting to make cuts throughs to facilitate we don't want to create boundaries. We want to have borders through which people can actually porous borders rather than boundaries, to use Richard Sennett's terms. I mean, it may just be helpful to elaborate a little bit because it was a key conceptual framework underneath, with thinking about what Richard Sennett from the LSE he's made a huge contribution in understanding post-industrial urban space, and really saying in his analysis that the role in managing the relationship between people and communities is greatly been helped by his piece of study, because his way of just looking at borders and boundaries seems relevant to social organisation as well as physical space. To quote him just briefly, this is an important distinction in the natural world. In natural ecologies, borders are the zones in a habitat where organisms become more interactive due to the meeting of different species or physical conditions. The boundary is a limit, a territory beyond which a particular species does not stray. So these are two different kinds of edge. For instance, in the border edge, where the shoreline of a lake meets solid land, there's an active zone of exchange. Here is where organisms find and feed off other organisms. The same is true of temperature layers within a lake. Where layer meets layer defines the zone of the most intense biological activity, whereas the boundary is a guarded territory, as established by prides of lions or packs of wolves. He then goes on through all of that to then say, in modern urban planning, the contrary condition of the inert closed boundary constructed by a much less solid and fixed sort of wall, i.e. in the form of highways, cuts through cities, and in a way they're less obvious, but they create these incredible edges where people can't cross. Invisible walls infamously have been used to mark off the territories separating the rich from the poor, or race from race. Porosity is lacking. Put as a general rule, in 20th century planning, motion has served as the instrument for making boundaries rather than borders. So I think that's particularly relevant in the urban world, but it was also to make sure that we weren't repeating some of this within the terrible suburban models of fences around gardens, the sense that you're in a beautiful place, but actually it's almost all private territory and you can't get from A to B without having to go on long circuitous routes, when actually you'd like to just bash straight through your neighbour's fence probably. So we then built on that to then look at the greenways that could then move along the lines of the hedgerows, and making these specific cuts in the hedgerows to be able to gain this porosity. And from that also developing some of the key green corridors through the ecotown along those lines of the hedgerows. Water, of course, is very important. Within the planning policy statement, it talks about water neutrality, and that's actually quite a difficult thing to achieve on a site like this. So we were looking at how to do, essentially the water neutrality, the concept is that total water used after a new development is no more than the total water used before the development. So that's quite a challenge. But we were augmenting existing waterways and ensuring that then the flow of the water through the site, and looking at SUDs and various other water systems that we could put in place, because we're also thinking carefully about what we're doing with managing waste, human waste. So we're then processing that through effectively wastewater gardens, internal greenhouses that are utilising the nutrients and producing water suitable to go back into the water system at the end of that. And the streets then are overlaid on top of that, but as I say, very much within a secondary role, with the green ways being the primary role and primary routes. The black is a existing farm at the centre, which we're looking to how is that taken over into community ownership. Large growing programs, showed images earlier of allotments. That is a major part of the thinking behind the growing in the locality, which is then avoiding those lots of trips to Waitrose, etc. And then creating identity within the ecotown, rather than having a monoculture of experience, really trying to create different identity. So this is back to placemaking. If we're not achieving proper placemaking, we're failing, because it turns into a place where you have a sense of the world is elsewhere. You know, one has to think of all the ages that would be living in this ecotown, and one doesn't want to just create a place which becomes somewhere teenagers don't want to be, somewhere people are just frustrated and also don't have a sense of their own identity within quite a large area. So we worked closely on that, and then this is really where we arrived at, which is probably too small to see there, but this is after a lot of study about density, what areas. We've got varying density within the master plan, possibly easier to see something of that back there, where we're creating more density around the south and the east, and just thinking of different house types. We haven't actually developed those house types very far, but one would be hoping to develop those once we've got planning in much more detail. There are very much thinking all the time about the quality of the places one's creating, whether they're dense. When I'm saying dense, it's this level of density rather than what we'd be talking about in an urban area. But one can see actually quite dense in areas with thinking 3 stories, 4 stories in some areas, but generally 2-story. And this is just some initial visuals about how one integrates roads, swales, open land adjacent to, in this case, that's a 3-story, 4-story building. Bridges across there, creating the right kind of environments for cycling, walking, and to properly appreciate this, what is an extraordinary opportunity to live in somewhere that's not suburban. I think all the time we've been thinking this is not suburbia, and doing whatever we can to ensure it's not suburbia. And that's often the risk with eco-towns, is that where they have started to go, not that there's many left, I think there's 4 eco-towns still on the table. North-east has been constructed of Bista. I haven't visited yet, but it's some of the photographs from that. I don't know, I'd be interested in anyone who has visited there, but it does feel slightly suburban. This is an image then of the wastewater processing plant, similar, that we would be using. Obviously we can create quality internal environments, and we'd look to do that in the next stage. But the key thing is if one's trying to truly create sustainable places to live, one wants to get all of these systems conditions right before one actually gets into the design of the houses. And those houses should be informed about making the most of the opportunity of their locality. So that's really where we've got to so far, and I just wanted to conclude by saying if there's one thing that would characterize the experience of living at Himley Village above its other very worthwhile qualities, that would be the close relationship between the natural and the built world. The land with its hedgerows, its wildlife, its water and its fertile soil is abundant in life, enhancing gifts, providing the design of the village is open to them. The run of the hedgerows, the track of the water over the contours, and the nature of the edges of the site have guided the organisation of the flow of people, vehicles, energy and waste, and the positioning of the buildings and private and public space. Together, these influences have led to the creation of a clear identity for the village as a whole and a strong sense of place in its neighbourhoods. Thank you.